Erev Shabbat Shalom Rabotai and Shushan Purim Sameach. Today's supposed to be a happy day because it's Shushan Purim. Unfortunately, we lost one of the greatest Torah leaders that we have in our generation, Maran Tzar Torah Reb Chaim Kanievsky, Zecher Tzdik V'Kadosh Levacha. Unfortunately, we lost a tremendous Torah leader, and we're left as, so to speak, orphans. But we have to have emunah in Hashem and look on to the next future leaders and continuing pushing and serving Hashem to our greatest ability, even though it could be very difficult because we lost such a tremendous leader in Torah. We're continuing with our Mishna Yomi, Mishna Demai, Perek Vav. We're up to Mishnah Chet. Yesterday's Mishnah, we learned about when partners divide their produce, the one who is careful about tithing has to separate tithes for half of his partner's share as well, if his partner is not careful to tithe properly. The Mishnah now is going to teach us several situations where one partner who is careful to tithe would not have to separate tithes for his partner's share if he is not careful. If two people received a field together in a sharecropping agreement, or shiarshu, or they inherited a field together, or shnishtatefu, or they became partners in a field, meaning they bought a field together, and one of them is careful about tithing, while the other one is an amaretz, he's not careful about tithing. When they come to divide the produce, the one who is careful can tell the amaretz, you take the wheat that is in such and such place in the field, and I will take the wheat that is in such and such place in the field, meaning different parts of the field. Or you take the wine in such and such place in the field, and I will take wine that is in such place in the field, different place. Because since each partner takes his share of the produce from a different part of the field, they're not considered selling their shares to each other. That would be asur. Rather, they are really determining which part of the crop belonged to each one from the very beginning. Therefore, the partner who is careful to tithe needs to separate tithes only from his portion of the wheat or the wine and not of his partner's share. And the Rav explains to us that this Mishnah is working off the concept called yesh birera. Now, birera really means retroactive clarification, which is like this. Basically, it's saying that a determination can be made at a later time, and that will clarify the legal status of something at an earlier time when it was really unclear. And this will take effect retroactively, meaning that once this determination is made, we view it that this is how it really was all along. It's a machloket Tanaim and Eruvin and Mesechet Gitin, but our Tana relies on the ownership of the produce. He relies on it to determine the ownership of the produce back to the time when they first took over the field. Meaning now, when I tell my partner, I'm taking this part and you're taking that part of the field, really this is who owned what in the beginning. Now, this doesn't contradict the Mishnah that we learned yesterday, because there the Mishnah spoke about grapes that had already been harvested. Our Mishnah is speaking about dividing wheat or grapes that have not been cut and are still attached to the ground. So according to the Tana of our Mishnah, when partners divide a crop while it is still attached to the ground, based on which part of the field it grew, it makes sense to say that this division retroactively determines who owned which part of the crop from the beginning, because what is it doing? It's clarifying which part of the land belonged to which partner, and that's the normal way to divide land. However, once the wheat or the grapes were cut and they no longer are connected to the ground, the division of the cut produce, when you say you're taking this cut produce and I'm taking that, that cannot show us who owned which part of the land, because there's no land anymore. The most it can do is show us which individual stocks of wheat or clusters of grapes that grew together were owned from the very beginning by which partners. But the Tana or Mishnah does not want to follow yesh birak to this extent to avoid the problem of exchanging shares. Therefore, it would only work if you are splitting the fields. Why? Because again, since each partner takes his share of the produce from different parts of the field, they're not called selling, they're called really determining which part of the field belonged to which owner, and therefore you only tithe from his own portion and not his partner's. Aval, however, the Mishnah says, Lo yomar lo, he cannot tell him, Torata chitim bani seorim, you take the wheat and I'll take the barley, Torata yain bani etor shemen, or you take the wine and I'll take the oil. Why? Because when each one is going to agree to take a different type of produce for himself, that's considered a sale, and we know that it's asur to sell Tevin. Now, the Mefarshim point out to us that even if the produce is still attached to the ground, if one partner is going to receive his share from one type of grain and the other partner from a different type, the transfer is going to be considered like you're exchanging shares, which is a form of selling Tevin. For example, let's say they both jointly owned wheat, they planted wheat and barley. each partner really has the rights to both the wheat and the barley. We own it jointly. If they decide now that one's going to take all the wheat and one's going to take all the barley, you cannot say yesh birera. You cannot say that retroactively. We're going to clarify to determine that really this partner owned the wheat the whole time and this partner owned the barley the whole time. Therefore, the division by necessity really is considered a trade of one partner's share of wheat for the other partner's share of barley. That's called the sale, and you're now allowed to sell tevel. That is in Rabotai Mishnah Chet. Mishnah Tet is going to give another case where I don't have to worry about separating my partner's shares if he's an Am Haaretz. Chaver ve'Am Haaretz she'arshu et aviem Am Haaretz. If two brothers, one's a chaver, meaning he's trusted about the laws of Tumah and Tara, and for sure he's trusted about the laws of Tirumot and Masrot. Ve'Am Haaretz, and the other brothers an Am Haaretz, and they inherited property from their father who was also an Am Haaretz, meaning the Rav says that all the produce that the father left them is assumed to be Tameh and Demai. When they come to divide the inheritance, the Chaver brother can tell his Am Haaretz brother, you take the wheat that is in such and such place in the field, and I'm going to take the wheat that's in a different place in the field. Or you take the wine that's in this part of the field, and I'm going to take the wine that is in this part of the field, like we learned in the previous Mishnah. Because again, the Mifarshim tell us we're talking about a case where the wheat and the grapes are still attached to the ground. Therefore, when they divide the produce according to the part of the field or the vineyard in which it's growing, the Chaver brother does not have to tithe the part of his brother's share, and there's no concern of the produce being tameh, because produce that's still attached to the ground cannot become tameh. Aval lo yomar lo, but he cannot tell him, Tolata chitim v'ani serim, you take the wheat and I'll take the barley, Tolata alach v'ani tolata yavesh, or you take the wet produce, which may be tameh, and I'm going to take the dry produce, which is not tameh, because like we learned in the previous Mishnah, when you exchange two different types of produce for each other, that's always considered a sale. And wet and dry produce are also considered different variations. Since it's asur for a chaver, somebody who's trusted by Tumah and Tara and Masrot to sell to an Am Haaretz, either Demai or produce that can become Tameh, he cannot divide the inheritance with his Am Haaretz brother in this manner. Now, although the father's produce we already said is assumed to be Tameh since he was an Am Haaretz, it's not definitely Tevel. Therefore, it would be assumed to give it to another Am Haaretz who might make it Tameh if it was not already Tameh, because you can't make Tevel Tameh. Now, the Mifarshim do point out to us that when we spoke about you take the wet produce, he tells his Am Haaretz brother, you take the wet produce, which may be tameh, and I'll take the dry produce, which is not tameh. The Mifarshim say the Mishnah is talking about a case where the produce was harvested, because in order that for something to be tameh, it has to be harvested already. However, before it can become tameh, we learned it has to be mukhshar l'tumah, it has to be prepared or susceptible for tumah by being made wet with one of these 7 liquids that we prepare a food for tumah, which we're going to say in Masechet Machshirin, Perek Vav Mishnah Daled, which is dew, wheat, wine, olive oil, blood, milk, or honey. Dry produce, meaning produce that never became wet with any of these liquids, is not able to become tameh. Since the original owner of the produce, which is the father, the Am Haaretz, any wet produce that you left as inheritance has to be assumed to be tameh. So it would technically be beneficial for the chaver who only eats tahor food for him to take the dry produce that he knows to be tahor and leave the wet produce, which is assumed to be tameh, for his Am Haaretz brother. But again, you are not allowed to do this because since the chaver is not allowed to sell an Am Haaretz either demai or produce that can become tameh, he cannot divide the inheritance in this manner. The most that he could do is say, you take the wheat in this part of the field, I'll take the wheat in that part of the field, or you take the grapes in this part of the field and I'll take the grapes in that part of the field. That way we split fields while it's still on the ground. We have no issue of tameh, and even if it's a problem of demai, since we retroactively say we owned these parts in the beginning, I'm going to take care of my portion, and I don't have to worry about my Am Haaretz brother's portion. That is the end of today's Mishnah Yomi, Rabotai. Everybody should have a Erev Shabbat Shalom and a Shushan Purim Sameach. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen v'amen.